Welcome to Impostrix podcast, where we affirm the lived experiences of professionals of color who navigate imposter syndrome and racial toxicity at work. The tools that you learn here will help you confidently address racial toxicity at work, put that imposter syndrome to the side, stand in your power, and resist racial gaslighting. I'm your host, Whitney Knox-Lee, a Black mother to Black boy children, a civil rights attorney, and an anti-racism educator and trainer. If this is your first time listening, welcome. We're glad you're here. Episodes are published every week. Make sure you go back and listen to our past episodes. All right, here we go. Hey, y'all. So this is part 2 of an episode with my friend, Karla Garcia. Karla is a bicultural and bilingual mental health therapist and professional out of Washington State. In the first episode, if you didn't have a chance to listen, we talked about Karla's personal experience dealing with racism and being put in a special education classroom when she first arrived to Washington State because the administrative professionals and the teachers at her school thought that she had some kind of learning issue or behavior issue because she wasn't acting like the other students, the white students that were in her class. And then we talked about colorism and what colorism looks like in communities of color. So this is a continuation of that conversation. I invite you to go back and listen to part 1 if you haven't done so yet. Here we go.
I'm a first generation Mexican, and I identify as a Mexican. I don't tend to use labels as Latinx, Latino, Latin, or Latin, or Hispanic. And part of that is because I don't like labels being put on me, and a lot of the origin of any of these labels is based on government and what this country has dictated for people. So that identity is also very rooted into this is who I am. And so I describe myself as just Mexican, and which sometimes confuses a lot of people.
It's surprising to me that when you tell people that you're Mexican, they're still looking for more. Like they're looking for the language that we use here in the United States, as you mentioned, so that you will fit within their framework of what being a brown-skinned person who speaks Spanish means.
And ironically, with that, kind of what you and I were talking about into this segue of colorism and acceptance into community is that when I tell people I'm Mexican, especially older generations, and they ask me how long I have been in the United States because I have no accent, when I do tell them, they will tell me, oh, well, you're from here now, you're just white, even though clearly I'm not.
Yeah, like the erasure there of what your experience has been, because you're still an immigrant and immigrants have very different experiences than those of us who aren't immigrants. And I'm thinking too about how, like, I wish I knew more about my ancestry and like where my people are from. We did an ancestry.com situation, and I know that we have ancestry in Ghana and Senegal. But I don't know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't tie any one cultural value, if you will, to my family other than what my family of origin and their families of origin have come up with. If I did know those things, having somebody tell me, well, you've been here long enough, so you're basically white, that would be a really conflicting and uncomfortable conversation for me to have. I think it's such a privilege for people to know where they're from and to know their ancestry, being a Black person who does not know any of these things. And I'm always interested to hear about what culture and like family of origin culture like means to people, because there are a lot of people who it does mean something. And for me, my culture personally and my personal like identity as a Black woman does not really extend beyond my family in terms of, I mean, how do I say this? I know that we experience intergenerational trauma. I know that I have relatives all over the United States. And so it's always, I love hearing about rituals and customs that have been passed down in families because, what we know about my family is very short. We have a very short history um, here in the United States.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, it's so complex and fascinating, right? And I mean, I did an ancestry too, and when I found out like how much Aztec I had in me, it was kind of like a validating thing, right? Like, see, I am Mexican and I did originate from this country, and you can't tell me that I am white. Like, I have proof. There's blood in me that says I'm 51% Aztec. Like, this is my indigeneity, and this is where it comes,
and the crazy part for me is that, like, you were born in Mexico,
right?
like, but for you to need ancestry.com or wherever to tell you about this part of your history, your personal history, and to validate you because we have people who feel as though, well, you're Americanized, so you're white, and you're not close to your culture anymore. Just seems like its own form of gaslighting.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think part of that too is, when we came here back in the early 90s, it was completely different than immigrants coming now, right? Because the thing about that, I mean, there's still some similarities, right? But the thing back then was that you saw a lot more people like you that were more welcoming, right? And it was easier to fit in. Now, because time has gone by, there's been more racism, more microaggressions, more racial trauma happening. That people, what I've seen is that are starting to shy away from your original culture, right? And then we get into assimilation and acculturation, but they start pulling away from that and find that shame piece, right? And then we get into internalized oppression. And when that starts to happen, what I've noticed is that people will try to find either you have to be 100% of this, right? So I either have to be 100% Mexican or I am 100% American and it cannot be in the middle, right? Because I'm not Mexican enough or I'm not white enough. And so then we kind of get people in my generation that came here in the 90s, we kind of get put in the middle of we don't belong to either community or we're not fully accepted by other community because they're constantly questioning what we're doing, right?
Yeah, and I think what I experience, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more on what it looks like for you, is this idea that, like, the two identities can't happen at the same time. And so if we are doing what our communities consider being like white or operating in whiteness. So for me as a Black person, often what I would hear people say is that I talk white, that I speak white.
Hmm.
So if we're doing that, then we can't also speak Black. It's like it's either one or the other. Both things can't happen at the same time. And whether that's success and what success looks like, if we're successful in this kind of like white Americanized world, then can't, that's not the same and it can't be congruent and happening at the same time as being like successful within my culture. How we operate in this life here in the United States and the values that we hold as Americans sometimes, oftentimes, does not align with our values in our cultures. And when that happens, sometimes I do find myself caught in the middle and not to the extent or differently than you,
Hmm.
I suppose, but it's still very much a thing that I think a lot of us experience, and particularly those of us who do work in these professions where we're one of a few, or where we're kind of breaking barriers, even just being in the profession. And we're, maybe called sellouts is something that I think a lot of people say, or Uncle Toms for Black folks. And so it is an interesting dynamic that, we have to navigate. And that's part of the reason for this podcast is figuring out how we can be more authentically us in the face of racial toxicity, but not just from white people, because white supremacy doesn't need white people. White supremacy is an idea that can be perpetuated by folks of color, whether or not we mean to, um, and that's because it's the air that we breathe. Thank you so much for listening and for your support. I wanted to take a quick moment to suggest 3 other ways that you can support Impostrix podcast. The first is by donating. Yes, sending me money. The podcast costs approximately $130 per month for me to produce, and that comes out of my pocket. Why? Because I love you and I love what we're working towards, and it's worth it for me. But if you would like to help in covering some of these bills that include my Buzzsprout subscription, my Canva subscription, all the random little subscriptions, I welcome you to do that. I would happily accept those dollars. And you can do that by looking at the show notes for this episode and looking for the link that says support the show. That will take you to the Buy Me a Coffee page where you can donate. I want to go ahead and thank Peggy Wolf, because Peggy has donated to Impostrix podcast. I so appreciate it. Peggy is one of my friends from law school, and I'm so grateful for you, Peggy. So thank you. All right. Way number 2 that you can support Impostrix podcast is by subscribing to the newsletter. You can subscribe to our monthly newsletter by going to the website www.impostrixpodcast.com and clicking on the newsletter tab. I promise this will be monthly, and it's not even going to start until September. This is where you will get all the offline information that I'm not necessarily posting on social media or talking about in the podcast. It's where you will get discount codes for products and services that our guests are offering. And it's also where you can find all of the show notes in one place on a monthly basis. Okay, the third way that you can support Impostrix Podcast is by sharing the episodes. Go ahead, pick your favorite episode that you've listened to thus far and send it to one person that you think would really appreciate it, that would enjoy it, or that would learn something from it. Do that for me. I would really appreciate it. All right, back to Karla. So let's talk a little bit about the cultural beliefs that we sometimes have where success, or what we consider to be success, is viewed maybe as something that actually separates us from our cultural communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's also one of those things like, how do you define it? For my mother, success was me getting an education, marrying a good man, having a good family. That was her idea of success for me. Thankfully, I have those things.
Mhm.
I've worked my ass off to accomplish those things, right? Um, and yet, I am still being told by people in my community that my success is tied to my husband. It's not an individual thing, right? It's always been a thing, a recurring theme that has always said to me by people, particularly men of color, you don't have to worry. Your husband makes enough money anyway. You're never going to make as much as he makes anyway, so why even try? So my success, according to my mother, all my accomplishments according to my mother is huge success. My success, according to other people of color, particularly men, is nothing because my husband's success completely overshadows what
Right.
I've done and what I do and how much I bring in or don't bring in or whatever the case may be.
In the Black community, what I experience is almost not the reverse, but it is different because so many of our men are incarcerated. And so, where certainly our man, my husband, has this value of being able to provide for his family, like that's his number one job. He has to have a job so that he can provide for our family. I think if he lost his job and couldn't provide for our family, that would be like a soul illness that he would experience. Like it's so ingrained in him. But so many Black folks are growing up or living in homes that don't have Black men. And so Black women have become um, not only the spiritual matriarch and the love dealer and the support part of the household, which I think we've always had, but also the financial responsibility. And so it's interesting because I don't think that my success is even attached to my husband's success.
Mhm.
I think they're very separate, although we have a family, we have this business relationship called marriage. So it's just interesting to me to hear you talk about like in your community what it means to have a husband who makes a considerable amount of money.
Right. And I think you touched on a really important fact is that it's not individual success. Like you said, I have my success, my husband has mine. But in my culture, for me, it has always been attached to my mother, attached to my siblings, or attached to my husband. To everyone outside of my own self, it has never been an individual success. It has always been tied to somebody else's idea of success, what they have wanted for me, what they have sacrificed for me. And that sense of paying back, paying forward, right?
Mm.
That attachment has always been there. But for me, it's my own individual success, yet it's so hard to break away from everybody else's idea of how successful I am because I do have a husband, because I do have kids, because I was able to have a body that I was able to carry two beautiful children, right? It's like I'm a little octopus with so many little tentacles coming out of me. Like there's always somebody that has something that they have wanted, pushed for, sacrificed that you never let go of, right? And
Yeah.
they never let go of that.
Yeah. So what's your individual definition of success for you? What does success look like?
So I'm not even going to ask if you remember this about school because you probably don't remember this about school. But in undergrad, we read a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I remember this book and just a little background on him. He was a Jewish person who was incarcerated during World War II, psychiatrist, and he wrote a book after he got out. And one of the most powerful things that I read in there, one of the quotes was, they can keep my body imprisoned, but as long as they don't have my mind, I am a free person.
Mm,
And so when we talk about all of this racial trauma, imposter syndrome, everything that comes with it, for me, my own success has been able to keep my mind free, to keep my mind centered in the fact that I am an individual, that I have worked so hard by myself to accomplish all the things that I have. And I have grounded myself in reframing a lot of this stuff, right? Keeping that freedom of thought, keeping that freedom of myself, what the notion of self is, that inner dialogue of constantly reframing of I have weathered through a lot. You know, I live with a mental illness, I live with depression, I live with PTSD from past traumas. That's a constant struggle, right? And if anybody's struggled through depression, you know how that takes over your mind and then it takes over your body and then it takes over your life. So it's a constant having to reframe of you are the person that has done this. You are the person that has physically moved your arms and legs to get out of bed, to push through, to go to college, to fight everything. This is who you are, not defined by anybody else. And that has kept me grounded in my idea of I myself have a sense of self that is not tied or does not feel tied to others. And
mhm.
that to me is success.
Yes, I love that. So having a sense of self that's not tied to others. And as a mother too, like that's so difficult. I think for me, success does have to do with this inner knowing of who I am. And then that I'm living within my values. I do think it's authenticity, but I like to remind myself that authenticity comes with risk. And so when I can't be authentic, I don't view that as like not being successful. But what success does look like in that situation then is figuring out and being more clear about what I need to get out of this space that might not be serving me so that I can move on to the next space that will be serving me. And then like having an idea of like having a goal, because I guess I don't feel like I can be successful if I don't have a a point to get to. Otherwise, I guess I just feel like I'm like floating in limbo. I need to have something to work towards. And I think that goes maybe towards ambition and less so towards success. But just thinking about like, what are the things that I want to achieve? What's my purpose? What's my purpose here on this earth? And am I even like facing towards my purpose?
Mm.
I don't even have to be close, but am I facing it? Do I see it? Do I know where it is? And then identifying what I need to do to get there.
Yeah, maybe you should read this book.
Yeah, you said the name of the book. I'm like, nope. But I swear to God, I was there. Like I was there. I actually did okay in school. And well, during those 2 years of school, I did okay. But all right, Karla, we're gonna wrap this up. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming and for sharing with us a little bit about what drives you, what your journey has been, and your identities. Do you want to maybe give your website, tell us how we can find you, where we can find you?
Yeah, so I'm based out of Seattle, Washington. So all the work that I do is here. My website is garciacounseling.com. And then for those that are in Washington State, pretty soon you're going to be able to hear me on the radio over in Eastern Washington with Radio KDNA doing some mental health with immigrant communities. But thank you,
Awesome.
Whitney, for having me.
So I love this conversation because for me, what it really highlights is that when we're dealing with imposter syndrome and racial toxicity, it's not a thing that just white people perpetrate against people of color. This is something that's happening within our communities of color and within white communities as well. And I think that's important for us to identify when it's happening and for us to recognize this is something that we all are having to deal with and that we're all needing to find personal accountability around, not just when we're talking to white people, but also when we're talking to people within our own racial cultures or within other racial cultures. I'd love to hear from listeners what you think about today's conversation. If you resonate with what Karla and I shared today, I'd love to hear from you about what success means to you and how you're able to tell whether or not you feel like you're being successful or living in success today. So I think this is pretty cool because over the last couple of weeks, I've gotten my first couple of reviews on Apple Podcasts. I just want to share them with you. The first is from Neek, and it says, Flowers for Whitney. This podcast is a shining light in the dull and dismissing world of being a BIPOC professional. Whitney illuminates our experiences, and while we all have varying distinctions of said experiences, she makes us feel like we're not alone. Her vulnerability in voicing that she is learning with us is not only comforting, but it's uplifting. If you haven't started listening, then do yourself a favor and tune in ASAP. Oh, thank you. I love flowers. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that that is the experience that you're having because that's exactly what I am hoping to convey to you. So thank you, Neek. The second review that I want to read is from Eulemios. I'm sorry if I did not pronounce that right. And it says, Empowering perspectives, a captivating must listen. Ooh, I got shivers. Prepare to be moved. This podcast is a game changer, delving into the complexities of imposter syndrome for BIPOC people while giving actionable insights and tools to share with people who also deal with these challenges. Kudos to the exceptional host whose empathy and honesty create a safe and nurturing space for guests to share their stories authentically. The host and guests bring an infectious enthusiasm and honesty to their conversations and are eager to share knowledge here. As a white woman, I think this podcast is a must listen for those of us who are seeking personal growth, cultural humility, and a deeper understanding of allyship. I eagerly await the next episode to continue learning. Thank you. I love this because, yes, this podcast centers folks of color. Absolutely, it does. And all of us have something to learn here, not just people of color and not just white people. I mean, we are learning together, and I love that, especially where it can be so challenging because it's such a charged topic to talk about race, and to talk about race in the workplace in particular is just a very difficult thing to do. And so I'm hoping, particularly for white folks, that as you're listening to these episodes, you're able to get some more insight into potentially what your colleagues are saying about their experiences, and getting some questions answered that maybe you're not comfortable asking. I think that I'm hoping for this to be a great eavesdrop for you, a meaningful eavesdrop. All right, y'all. Thank you. Keep it coming. Keep it coming. If you haven't rated Impostrix podcast yet, I invite you to do that. I would really, really appreciate it. The podcast charts and all of that are based off of ratings, and they're based off of listens. So if you do enjoy this show, please go ahead and give me 5 stars, whether that's on Spotify or Apple Podcast or Good Pods or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Give me 5 stars, and I do love reading reviews. So if you want to type something up, I would appreciate that too. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to listen to past episodes and to subscribe. You can also follow me on social media. Also, feel free to leave me a message. I want to know what you think about this show. So you can do that by leaving a review, or you can do that by sending me an email at impostrixpodcast@gmail.com. This podcast is for me, and this podcast is for you. And I hope that you're leaving this podcast and this experience feeling validated, because that's the goal. Be validated. Until next time.